From the G7 to NATO, Biden's whirlwind trip continues overseas. Netanyahu is out as Israel's longest-running prime minister, and a new coalition government takes shape, including Arab Islamists. And In the Heights, not hitting the heights at the U.S. box office. So what gives? Monday Need to Know. Let's go. Good morning. This is Cheddar's Need2Know podcast for Monday, June 14th. I'm Jill Wagner with Baker Machado. Hello, Baker.
Hello. Happy Monday, Jill Wagner. What an amazing day today. It is a Monday after a great weekend. It is raining here in New York City. The Westminster Dog Show concluded over the weekend. Oh, and by the way, it's your birthday. Happy birthday, Jill Wagner. How did you celebrate this weekend?
I celebrated with some friends. We went to a really fun restaurant right on the water in Oyster Bay.
Nice.
And it was great. And I felt like pandemic what?
Yeah, no, Jill, so was this like one of your first nights out? Like get the babysitter, put on a nice dress,
Yes.
Put on makeup, it's Saturday night, we're going large.
It was a very specific instruction to everybody who came. No kids.
Yes,
Kids are not included in this event as much as we love them. So it was great. I mean, no, we were all still, it was called for 6 p.m. I mean, we were still home by 10:30 and exhausted, but it was nice.
Either way, it's amazing that feeling that you get when you finally go back to a bar with your friends. You don't have to wear a mask. Everything gets back to normal, so congratulations, Jill.
Thank you. I had my Moscow Mule. I was watching the sunset, and I was pretty happy.
Dream.
All right, Baker, let's get to some news here. President Biden heading to his first NATO summit in Brussels today. All eyes are going to be on this big meeting that he has with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday. But let's talk a little bit about what happened this weekend, the G7 summit. It was the first time that those leaders met in person since the pandemic started. The group vowing to provide a total of more than 1 billion coronavirus vaccine doses to countries in need. G7 leaders also calling for a transparent and expert-led investigation into the pandemic's origins. President Biden saying still not yet any certainty about whether or not coronavirus originated from a bat interfacing with animals or whether it was an experiment gone awry in a laboratory. China's embassy in London denouncing the G7 meeting, saying in a statement that a small group of countries can no longer dictate global decisions.
All right, so another obvious huge highlight, Jill. You know this is something that I'm obsessed with. The Queen, yes, Queen Elizabeth hosted President Biden and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden at Windsor Castle on Sunday night. President Biden, Jill, even compared the Queen to his mom. He described her as extremely gracious. Now, no doubt the occasion marked the Queen's first one-on-one meeting that she's had with a world leader since the start of the pandemic. But I also, Jill, want to mention how different this G7 summit is compared to the previous G7 summit that we had 3 years ago when former President Trump was in office. You might famously remember President Trump didn't sign off on the big climate pledge that was supposed to happen at the end and conclude at the G7 3 years ago. And then he famously tweeted on Air Force One that Justin Trudeau was very dishonest and a weak leader. So that no doubt threw the entire G7 summit into turmoil. But you can see all the leaders here looking at Biden and America much differently here. You have Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Britain, calling Biden a breath of fresh air. You have Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, coming out saying how happy he is to have a negotiating partner in the United States finally once again. So no doubt a very different G7 from what we had 3 years ago.
And next up, though, is NATO. A lot of challenges. So NATO's 30 member nations certainly challenged as they try to agree on how to confront Russian aggression and also China's human rights abuses. Biden, again, meeting with Putin Wednesday. Russia recently said that U.S.-Russia relations are at a low point, the worst that it's been since the 80s. And Biden saying that he essentially agrees with that.
Look, China and Russia were going to be two of the most difficult hurdles for Biden to do during the G7 summit, given the fact that those two countries have a much different relationship with Europe in a post-Trump world. In the Obama years, you probably would have been able to get all these European allies to sign off on condemning Russia and China, but things have obviously evolved. Biden said he was satisfied with the G7 stance on China, but I should note they ended the summit with basically coming to a conclusion that they're going to create a working group to evaluate the human rights abuses that are happening in China. And then let's go to Putin. That's obviously the big event that's happening on Wednesday. Joe Biden announced over the weekend that he is going to do a solo press conference at the end of the Putin meeting on Wednesday. We remember years ago when Putin met with Trump, that was a different story. One, we didn't even get transcripts of what the two leaders even talked about. And then they famously had their press conference together where President Trump basically said that Russia was not involved in the hacking of the elections and all that other stuff, or that he spoke with Putin about the election hacking, but that he understood it. It was a very surreal, weird moment. Joe Biden obviously doing things very different here. So Wednesday, going to be must-see television here, Jill.
Some updates now on the vaccination effort. The state of New York nearing President Biden's goal of 70% of adults having received at least one vaccine dose by July 4th. Governor Andrew Cuomo saying that according to New York stats, 67.2% of adults have received at least one dose. Currently, the state also has the lowest daily positive test rate, just 0.44%. Even more proof that vaccines do work. And soon, maybe another tool in our arsenal, Novavax, saying that a large study found its vaccine is 90% effective against the virus and also protected participants against variants, which are the new concern right now.
Absolutely. Let's also talk about another vaccine here, Jill. Novavax's vaccine expected to play a huge role in vaccinations across the world right now. And it's really needed because of where we're seeing so many countries where in Africa, for instance, less than 1% of that continent is vaccinated right now. This is good because this Novavax vaccine is easy to store, it's easy to transport. Novavax also says they're going to seek emergency authorization here in the U.S., Europe, and elsewhere by September. They expect to be able to produce 100 million doses a month by that time. And to your earlier point, Jill, about how different the pandemic is, yesterday we only announced 101 deaths from the coronavirus yesterday. We only had about 5,000 new cases yesterday from the pandemic, which is incredible from where we were at. But this is why still so many people say, like Dr. Fauci, we're not out of the woods. Where you mentioned New York, 70% vaccination rate. In the South, it's not even close to that, Jill, which is why in Britain, who also is doing incredibly well with their vaccinations, are pausing some of their reopening because of that Delta variant that is wreaking havoc there. Fauci is even saying here in the South, if we don't get those vaccination numbers up here in the South, that Delta variant that it was in India is going to wreak havoc in the South. What does that do? I mean, yes, it does well. The vaccinations are doing well against that variant. But Jill, this is going to be a tale of basically two Americas here soon, where you're going to have everything open and ready to go here in New York City and New York and other places. But in Alabama, it's going to be a completely different story.
All right, one place that did very well with vaccinations, Israel. But let's talk, the bigger story there is Israeli politics. Benjamin Netanyahu ousted as Israel's prime minister after 12 years in office. Israeli parliament approved by just one vote a new and unprecedented coalition. It's a government that's made up of 8 different parties, left-wing, centrist, right-wing, an Islamist Arab party, and it's not totally clear how it's all going to work, but this is what we know so far. The prime minister, Naftali Bennett, he's going to be prime minister for 2 years. And after that, centrist leader Yair Lapid, he's going to serve for the latter 2 years. So they're basically splitting up the term. Bennett was actually Netanyahu's former chief of staff. He was a protege of Netanyahu and perhaps even further to the right than Netanyahu. For that reason, a lot of Palestinians saying, new coalition government, so what? This doesn't change much for us. But Bennett's party only has a handful of seats, so he's going to be forced to do some major compromising. The coalition, as I mentioned, includes a party that represents Israel's Arab citizens. And it sounds like the focus, at least right now, for this government is going to be on domestic issues, repairing just the fabric of Israeli society. We saw with this latest round of fighting between Gaza and Israel, between Hamas and Israel, something that we hadn't really seen before, which is Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis fighting against each other in Israel's borders. And that was pretty unprecedented. So Naftali saying it's going to be a government of change. Netanyahu is the opposition leader now, so he doesn't go away. He's still facing a corruption trial. And it sounds like he's going to do everything in his power to get back in power.
Jill, even the statements that Netanyahu is putting out there, this reminds you of Donald Trump in the sense that Donald Trump continues to say that the election was a scam. He'll do everything he can to get back in power, which is why we continue to talk about Donald Trump potentially running again in 2024. Netanyahu, by the way, has also called Bennett, who you mentioned, his former chief of staff, a traitor. At one point yesterday, Netanyahu refused to even shake his hand, and then eventually they did shake hands towards the end. He even tweeted a couple days ago that this is the scam of the century, which is literally something you would have seen former President Donald Trump tweet as well. But I want to go back to something you mentioned here about this coalition here, Jill, because this is incredible about how different worlds and their parliamentary systems work compared to what we do here in the United States. Essentially, imagine a coalition government that doesn't have a lot of votes. Basically, they're on a very tight, coalition where you need all the votes that you possibly can here. But a coalition that is made up of Ted Cruz, AOC, and Joe Manchin. That is essentially what this coalition is. You have like three completely different perspectives and factions of this party.
Eight.
Yes, exactly. But you're doing this basically teetering on, will this work, will this not work? And you have Netanyahu, who is, as you mentioned, the opposition leader here, but is going to do everything he can to get back into power trying to sabotage as much as he possibly can. This is a perilous position right here, especially if you're only going to be prime minister for 2 years and then another person's taking over in 2 years.
I mean, yeah, Baker, Netanyahu only needs two seats here. So he's going to be doing everything that he can to work back channels to try and pick off as many votes as he can. The thinking, though, was, at least from Bennett, that if Israelis had to go back for a fifth election, okay, so just remember the backdrop here is that Israelis have now had 4 elections in 2 years, okay? Now, if they had to go back for a fifth election, the thinking was that a centrist, a much more centrist or even left of center party would win, especially after this recent round of fighting and just where the country is at this point. So this seemed in some ways like the best possible scenario, even for Bennett. Because if they did have to go back for a fifth election, obviously we don't know what the turnout would have been, and who knows what to have predicted. The thinking, though, was that it would have been a pretty centrist government.
Totally.
So we shall see.
I mean, look, Bennett has said some very controversial things. And look, as you mentioned, you have Netanyahu nipping for any vote that will get him back in there. So they're in a perilous position to begin with, but then essentially getting all eight of these political parties on the same page will be incredibly difficult. And we know how polarized we are here in the United States. Israel is just as polarized, Jill.
All right, let's talk a little entertainment, Baker. In the Heights, failing to reach the box office heights that many thought it would. The film brought in about $11.4 million for its opening in North America this weekend, according to Warner Brothers, falling short of projections that were at about $15 to $20 million. Reviews not to blame, because this film, as we were talking about before the weekend, now has a 96% score on Rotten Tomatoes. It had a 97%. In the Heights, releasing on HBO Max, though, as well, could have played a part in the lackluster box office numbers. I think, Baker, it is way too early to call this a flop. Because I think because of HBO Max and many other reasons.
Jill, 100%. Look, blockbusters, Godzilla vs. Kong, In the Heights, a Marvel movie, those basically tend to do incredibly well at the opening parts of the box office because everybody runs to the theaters to see it, and then towards the end, it starts to kind of peter out and fade out. Musicals typically don't work that way. You usually have the crazy, insane musical theater people like me sing it opening weekend, and then it has a slow burn because basically musicals are really word of mouth, and so they stay in theaters typically longer, and they still generate tons of money, but it just basically has a little bit of a slow burn here. The problem, as you mentioned, with In the Heights is it had a couple things going against it. One, this is an unfamiliar musical for a lot of people. This is, unless you've seen it on Broadway, you're not familiar with the music as to say maybe like a Les Mis or a Mamma Mia or something else that you're more familiar with the music here. Two, and this is most important, the fact that it was streaming simultaneously on HBO Max. All indications I've seen on Twitter were that it did really well on HBO Max, and I watched it on HBO Max over the weekend. But look, we'll see the next weekend if it still has the staying power. I think it's going to be great. I think it's going to be fine. I thought the movie was spectacular. I actually think it's going to end up with some Oscar nominations also. So I'm not worried about this, but this also goes to show, Jill, that like, in 2 months from now, I think that's when we really start to hold the films accountable at the box office better than we do now. Because right now, In the Heights, or sorry, not In the Heights, but A Quiet Place is number one at the box office, but it's not bringing in earth-shattering numbers yet because still 80% of theaters are open. There's still 20% that aren't even open just yet, and we haven't even gotten the blockbusters like Black Widow yet. So while I'm tempted to say look, this could be cause for concern, I'm not worried right now.
I mean, additionally, as we were talking about earlier, I kind of feel like because things are opening up back again and it's
People
summer,
don't want to go to
the weather's
theaters right
nice.
now.
I don't know if you want, I don't know if you necessarily want to go to the theater. If you're going out, you probably just want to go out, and if you want to see In the Heights, you can watch it on your couch.
Absolutely, Jill. No, I think you're 100% valid because the weather is nice. People are finally, for the first time, being able to go outside and experience life and see friends. That's not to say that the people that are going to theaters are not, doing all of that. But I think
there's nothing wrong if you want to go.
There's nothing wrong because again, I would absolutely go to a theater if I had the option to right now as well. I just think that until it's something that's earth-shattering and people have been waiting forever, I think Black Widow is going to be that film, and it's not coming out for a while. I think that's going to be the film that's going to bring people back to the theaters, Jill. But otherwise, people are going to go live their lives, and if they have the option to watch it on HBO Max, they'll do it.
All right, and let's talk some dogs, Baker. Wasabi, the Pekingese, won the Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show Sunday night, beating 6 other dogs to take home the top prize. The 3-year-old, 13.5-pound pup with a flowing coat won Best in Show at the 145th edition of the Westminster festivities. So the show was moved to June because of the pandemic. It also had to switch locations. It's normally held at New York's Madison Square Garden, but it was actually held instead on a country estate in New York's suburban Westchester County. The dogs were judged in outdoor areas. They competed for Best in Show honors inside of a giant air-conditioned tent. No spectators were there, but there were, of course, plenty of TV cameras.
Oh, yes. Do you remember last year, Jill, for the dog show when we watched it on Thanksgiving? They had cardboard cutouts of the audience members last year, so who knows what it's going to look like this year. But let's talk about Wasabi. I mean, Wasabi, the Pekingese, really did amazing. I mean, he also, as you mentioned, has a really big history. The tiny furry dog feels like he's 10 feet tall, according to one of the judges. He comes from doggy royalty, as you mentioned. His great-grandfather, a Westminster winner. His mother, named Sushi, also a champion as well. We should note Wasabi is going to celebrate tonight back home in Michigan. He's having a filet mignon, and his owner, by the way, going to have a glass of champagne. So congratulations, and well-deserved. This is a very cute dog. I'm typically not a fan of the Pekingese because they just have too much hair around them. They kind of look like little dust balls. But this one looks really, really cute.
Just a quick correction, and I Googled this. So the Westminster Dog Show is not the one that's on Thanksgiving.
Oh, it's not? Wow.
No, I think it's the National Dog Show. And I always get that confused also because I always assume that it's the Westminster Dog Show.
Right.
It's not. It's the National Dog Show that's on Thanksgiving, which had the cardboard cutouts.
Oh, my God. Here's me thinking there's one dog show for everything.
No, there's a few different dog shows. This is Westminster. There's also the National, as I was saying, the National Dog Show, which is on Thanksgiving. I'm thinking it must be really weird, though, because these dogs, it's like they do train. It's the same way in horse racing where I would think kind of enjoy the crowd, right? I mean, that's something that they're used to. It's the same way we've seen national tennis players and basketball players have to get used to performing in front of no fans.
I mean, I don't know.
I don't know if the dogs are different.
I was just going to say that because my dog tends to do better in smaller environments. I don't know how Trestle is, but Martin typically likes it when it's smaller. And if he has too many people around, he gets too excited and too many people are around. So maybe this is actually better for these dogs because they have less distractions for them.
And this dog that won with the hair, you've got to think that nice air-conditioned tent was probably lovely, although it's normally indoors, so it's usually.
By the way, to your earlier thing you were saying, this dog, Wasabi, competes a lot. He won his Best in Show honor, his first one back in November 2019, according to the New York Times. And then he spent last year competing 96 times. Now, despite just this year with all of the stuff that's happened, he's only competed in 4 sets of shows this year. But clearly, he was ready for Westminster.
Absolutely. And hopefully you say a filet mignon, but hopefully no wasabi, because that would definitely
No, nobody wants wasabi on their filet mignons.
All right, Baker, it has been a true pleasure.
I know, Carlo's back.
Carlo is back tomorrow, but it has been great. I'm actually on vacation in a couple of weeks, so we're going to be calling you again. We are never done with you here at the Need to Know podcast. Baker.
Yes, so sorry for our listeners that I have to come back after this.
All right, that is what you need to know for Monday, June 14th.